to not simply to have an impeachment vote. That's not, I think, what we're talking about, but to make that determination that Bob Mueller was constitutionally unable to make.
Yeah, and we'll get to that side of the politics of it. Some Democrats leapt in yesterday to the impeachment conversation. Others, namely Nancy Pelosi, saying, still, let's pump the brakes a little bit. John, earlier this month, you reported this for the AP, quote, after Barr skipped out on a congressional appearance last week, attention immediately turned to the possibility of Mueller testifying, and Trump was watching. The president stewed for days about the prospect of the media coverage that would be given to Mueller, a man Trump believes has been unfairly lionized across cable news and the front pages of the nation's leading newspapers for 2 years, according to 3 White House officials and Republicans close to the White House. Trump feared a repeat, but bigger, of the February testimony of his former lawyer and fixer Michael Cohen, which dominated news coverage and even overshadowed a nuclear summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Vietnam. Trump has long known the power of televised images and feared Americans would be captivated by seeing and hearing Mueller. Yesterday, we got a taste of that, of course. So what has been, we saw the public tweets, we saw the reaction from Sarah Sanders outside the White House yesterday saying, case closed. Robert Mueller has finished his job. It's time to move on. But what are they really feeling inside the White House?
So the White House was given a heads up the night before that Mueller would be giving a statement, but they weren't really apprised of what the contents would be. So the president, as he often starts his mornings, stayed in the White House residence yesterday and watched on television, just like Americans around the nation, to see what Mueller would say. To Mueller to finally break his silence after 2 years. His first public comments on camera since this investigation began. And the takeaways from our reporting were a few. The president's tweet came not even a half hour later, suggesting that there was insufficient evidence, was his phrase, to charge a crime. Now, insufficient evidence is a long way from total exoneration, which is what the president had been saying for weeks and weeks since the Mueller report was released. He was saying, falsely, that Mueller himself had suggested there was nothing for obstruction of justice, and correctly that there was no criminality in terms of a conspiracy to collude with Russia. What followed was a coordinated rollout from Press Secretary Sanders, from the Vice President, from the RNC, from the Trump campaign. Statement after statement after statement that suggested 2 things. One, that, again, claiming, not entirely correctly, that Mueller suggested there was no evidence here, there was no way to charge the president, but also, secondly, that on this talking point, that Mueller was closing up shop, that he was retiring, that he was moving on, and therefore America should too. What, of course, that is missing is so much of this seemed like it was Mueller handing the baton to Congress to say that should be next. And certainly people around the president are anxiously watching as to what is the next step from Congress. You know, Pelosi's holding back impeachment talk, but think about just after hearing Bob Mueller speak for 8 minutes, how that galvanized Democrats to talk impeachment, to double down on investigations. If Mueller were to go to Congress, something he clearly suggested yesterday he doesn't want to do, he doesn't want to have to testify, and if he did, he would just reiterate findings from the report. But even that, as one person close to the president put to me yesterday, that even if Mueller just read from the report for a couple hours, Americans would be captivated, and that would be damaging to this president.
Well, that's why I quite frankly think it's sanctimonious of Robert Mueller to basically say, I'm not going to testify, or, you know, obviously he will if he is forced to do so, but it's not really his choice to make. Why are so many government officials these days telling us when and will they will be accountable to the American public? Robert Mueller has served the country honorably, but the American taxpayers at the end of the day paid his salary. And saying to go to the report, that's like a book author. Can you imagine how publishers would respond if you say, like, oh, I'm not going to go promote my book, just read the book and you'll learn what it's all about. It just doesn't work that day anymore. And so he's up in this information landscape of asymmetric warfare when you've got a White House that's lying constantly, and he's saying, well, read the 500 pages, and it just doesn't. What is his duty as a public servant to get facts to the public?
And so Mueller needs a book tour with a country western singer, is
that's
what you're
right.
saying.
You should go on tour with Tim McGraw, and that brings us to John Meacham. So, John, Robert Mueller yesterday showed no appetite whatsoever to be in the middle of this fight any longer. He said, the report is my testimony. This office is closed. I'm resigning from the Department of Justice. As Elise says, that may not be his choice if he's subpoenaed, in fact. But he hopes to walk away from this and let Congress and the White House duke it out.
Yeah, I mean, it was Barnacle and Jonathan, I think will particularly appreciate this. Yesterday's lead wrote itself, the old contrasting scenes. You have Bob Mueller at the Justice Department in his suit speaking the language of Eliot Ness and due process and the Constitution to a fault, as Joyce was saying. And then you cut to down the street at Pennsylvania Avenue. The President of the United States is tweeting. And there you had this clash. It was in some ways an establishment versus the insurgent president. That, in a way, I hesitate to use the word establishment because it's just the rule of law, right? I mean, Bob Mueller was doing what he was asked to do. As Elise says, we can argue about that. But essentially, his message was, I wrote this report, I undertook this task, I wish you would read it. I do think the biggest headline was that wonderful double negative. You know, if he had not, if we thought he had not committed a crime, we would have said so, which is a wonderfully. You know, if you saw that sentence as an editor, you would fix it. Right. It's just it's a little too convoluted. But that right there is the point. Right? That Trump says a person is innocent. Mueller says if we thought he had committed a crime. I can't even say it. If we thought he had, I can't even quote it, which sort of proves my point. It's an unfair fight in this political atmosphere, and much to Willie's joy, I often bring up the 1860s. This yesterday to me felt a lot like the McCarthy era, where Joe McCarthy was making headlines by making charges, by grabbing attention and having a core of the people just with him no matter what. Director Mueller felt like an attempt for the Joseph Welch moment of have you no decency, sir, but without that drama. Mm-hmm. And so, to me, the big issue, and again, I think the thing that we're going to talk about and have to deal with for a long, long time, is yesterday was another example of the triumph of passion and tribalism over reason and fact. Mueller was speaking the language of reason and fact. Trump was speaking the language of tribalism and ideology. And guess who's going to win that fight in this climate? It's going to be Trump. But that's to me, the test of citizenship is to actually do what Mueller said and take a look at the report.
You know, Joyce, as usual, Dr. Meacham raises some legitimate and pertinent points, especially about Bob Mueller's use of language yesterday, sometimes convoluted, sometimes the double negative and stuff like that. But in terms of his use of language, one thing stood out to a lot of people when he was talking about obtaining full and accurate information from every person in terms of conspiracy and collusion and obstruction. And then he said, following that, when a subject of an investigation obstructs that investigation or lies to investigators, it strikes at the core of their government's effort to find the truth and hold wrongdoers accountable. He didn't say if a subject of an investigation, he said when. And that's particularly striking.
It's very striking. Mueller is extraordinarily careful about the language he used in this statement. Unlike most of his public appearances, he simply read from a script yesterday, which tells us that those were very informed differences. And he could have been talking generically out in the ether about obstruction cases, but he didn't. He made it very concrete, very personal to this president, who is, after all, the only subject that they appear to have considered for obstruction. And he used the language when, meaning that in his sense, there were cases in this investigation where prosecutors did not get evidence that they would expect to. And the report gives us some detail there, so I'll add on to Mueller's pitch. Everybody should read the book in this case. But even if all you read is the summary, Volume 1, you see that there were instances where prosecutors couldn't get access to witnesses because they used the Fifth Amendment privilege to avoid testifying. They're entitled to do that, fair enough. Other witnesses, Mueller says, lied. Other witnesses used apps to delete information that should have been available to investigators, and other information was harbored offshore and was beyond their reach. So Mueller, although he does make this finding that he does not indict on a conspiracy charge, is very careful both yesterday and in the report to say that they were seriously hampered in their efforts to